Lowell Winstrom, your subspace meditator, coming to you once again with the final installment in our series of meditations on Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Now, if we go no further in this final series, this final piece of my meditation / rant on The Force Awakens, then in conclusion, we can sum this all up with a few words by just saying that this was a tremendous letdown. After all of the hype, all of the anticipation, all of the energy that was poured into this movie by millions of fans, perhaps across the United States, and perhaps millions more, maybe even across the world, although I don't know what the opinions are in China and Great Britain and other parts of the UK and Europe, the European Union, Asia, wherever it might be, Australia, wherever it might be by now. I can definitely say, though, in my own researches, that there are literally thousands, and perhaps even by now tens of thousands of people who are in fact expressing their displeasure with how The Force Awakens turned out. This was the movie that was supposed to reset it all. After the prequels, after 10, 11 years, after Revenge of the Sith, of waiting, everyone thought this movie was going to relaunch and reclaim the mantle of Star Wars after what they perceived to be George Lucas's foul up, after Revenge of the Sith and all the 2 prequel movies that came before that. Unfortunately, I have to sum it up with one word: this movie sucked. I'm sorry, it did. And this was coming from a person who, quite frankly, went into this movie wanting to like it, went into this movie with a lot of excitement, ready to really get back into it, ready to really enjoy what he saw on the screen. And as you saw, of course, in my first, part of this, I did come out telling you that I did actually enjoy it and gave it a 3 stars. But as I reflected on what I saw after the hype died down and after logic returned, I could not, and I will not continue to praise this movie. It was okay. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you why in my conclusions as to what was going on. And I'm going to give you something else a little different in here. I'm going to read to you an outside article from my own, or pieces of it, because I think it's essential that we dissect some of the thinking, thought processes, and words of JJ, who I'm now calling JJ Abrams, in understanding how this tremendous piece of crap got to us on the screen, and how we cannot continue to accept this kind of nonsense, especially as episode 8 and 9 come along. If they're going to continue to give us derivative versions of what's already gone before, then they're telling us basically, screw you, we don't care what you think, we're in this to make money, we know that you pigs will slop it up like the crap that it is, we know that you mindless automatons will go out here and watch this no matter what, and we need to start making a strike back against this kind of idiocy. The idiocracy that is now foisting itself upon us from Hollywood and from other sources, quite frankly, even in music now. You're starting to see the same kind of garbage being put out, to us. Mindless nonsense, brainless stuff that has no thought behind it, no intellect, no intelligence, no philosophy, except what's already gone before. So let's get on with it. As before, I'm going to read to you a few reflections, and I'm going to throw in a few, a few different ideas in there as I go along. But I'm going to read to you from my blogspot, talaxionparticle.blogspot.com, and I will have a link in the low bar to this article, as well as a link in the low bar to another article that I'm going to read a few bits and pieces to you from, which the direct words of JJ Abrams are being spoken. I want you to hear those because it's important, I think, for you to dissect what this man has to say. I think all of you out there in the sound of my voice who are listening to this video will be intelligent enough to be able to dissect for yourselves a lot of the bollocks, quite frankly, that JJ Abrams has decided to give us as an excuse, as an apology for what he has done. So I chose to judge The Force Awakens based on its merits as a standalone movie, not as the first portion of a sequence. I also did not read the novelization, so I can't judge it as that tie-in either. I chose to judge this movie based only upon what I saw on the screen. And based upon that judgment, I found the storyline lacking in originality, in consistency, and in development. Whatever excuses were made by Jeffrey Jacob Abrams are, sadly and woefully, wanting, and they no longer deserve a patient ear from myself. Quite frankly, I'm going to argue in this video by any of us who are judging this man's work. After two abysmal Star Trek movies now, Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness, now this man has gone and screwed up another great science fiction franchise. Should we any longer trust this guy with any science fiction development? My argument is no, and I'm going to go on to tell you further why in this video. In fact, let's begin with JJ Abrams. Now, I call this man Jar Jar Abrams now. I'm also calling him JJ Apologist. And that's because he's disappointed me too often to let him off the hook. Now, once again, as he did with Star Trek Into Darkness, JJ Abrams has taken to the internet to try to explain and apologize for what he has done with Star Wars The Force Awakens. Now, the fact that he's done this, in my opinion, this is a punk move on this guy's part. He's trying to justify himself, and this demonstrates to me that his mind is stricken to the quick with personal knowledge that he's messed up once again. Now, I know that he's never going to apologize directly. He's never going to admit it directly. But I would like to ask this question. Do you have a guilty conscience just a little bit there, Abrams? Is that why you've gone and done what you've done? Now, let me tell you why I say this. There was an article that I read on the internet called JJ Abrams Addresses Complaints That Star Wars The Force Awakens is a Ripoff of A New Hope. Now, this is an article that I found on a website called Collider.com, COLLIDER.com, written by a man named Adam Chitwood, CHITWOOD, on January the 8th of this year. Now, in this article, and I'll read bits and pieces to you. I'm not going to read it all. I will provide a link to you in the low bar. Star Wars The Force Awakens, you know, that movie we've been anticipating, debating, worrying about for 3 years now, was finally unleashed into the world a little bit over a month ago, and we still haven't gotten tired of talking about it. In that sense, he said one thing correct. It helps that the film is lighting up the box office charts, already taking the #1 domestic crown off the top of Avatar's head and now working its way up the global all-time chart. The film was, thankfully, not terrible, and maybe more importantly, it offered up plenty of reason to continue talking about the story and characters long after we've left the theater. But for some, make that a lot. But for some, The Force Awakens fell short of expectations in one very specific way. How about a multitude of specific ways? It's too familiar to the original trilogy, Chitwood goes on to say. Indeed, when we finally got to experience The Force Awakens, we discovered that Abrams and co-writer Lawrence Kasdan used the story template of the original Star Wars, effectively building their film on top of the skeletal foundation of A New Hope. They didn't just build it on top of a skeletal foundation. They virtually copied it, almost scene for scene in some cases, and plot point for plot point. This wasn't just some skeletal foundation. This wasn't just a framework. I mean, they copied it bone, marrow, sinew, tissue, blood, everything here. And you can almost basically say that. But let's go on. There's a lonely, reluctant hero awaiting something bigger who gets roped into a big adventure to vanquish evil. There's a cavalier, dashing pilot. There's a finale that involves said pilot driving into one very specific weakness in the enemy's big weapon, which is essentially another Death Star. How many plot points from A New Hope did you read there? Chitwood goes on to say, as it turns out, these aren't just coincidences. This was all part of Abrams and Kasdan's plan. Speaking with THR, whatever that is, Abrams addressed complaints that The Force Awakens is simply a rehash of a Star Wars story fans already know. And he quotes Abrams now. It was obviously a wildly intentional thing that we go backwards in some ways to go forwards, in the important ways. Given that this is a genre, that Star Wars is a kind of specific, gorgeous concoction of George Lucas's that combines all sorts of things, ultimately the structure of Star Wars itself is a classic and tried and true as you can get. It was itself derivative of all these things that George loved so much, from the most obvious, Flash Gordon and Joseph Campbell, to the Akira Kurosawa references to Westerns. I mean, all of these elements were part of what made Star Wars. Now, to me, when I'm listening to, or should I say when I'm reading this, and there's no video of this. There's no video of JJ Abrams making this statement. This is all printed words here. But to me, quite frankly, as I'm kind of hearing Abrams' voice in my head saying this stuff, it almost seems to me like he's apologizing for what he's telling you. He's apologizing for telling you that they deliberately set out to make a carbon copy, essentially, of A New Hope. And he's also telling you, quite frankly, that we're going to use the excuse that George Lucas himself copied a lot of the classic archetypal hero tales and archetypal hero ideals in his story. So that justifies us doing what we did. That is what Abrams did and what Disney did, and basically making a near carbon copy of A New Hope. That's what this is saying to me, and it's almost looking to me like he's backing away from a bunch of people who've gathered around him, maybe a big couple of burly guys who are about to beat his butt down for doing something like this, and he's trying to say, look guys, he's trying to justify what he's done so he doesn't get his nose bashed in. That's what this kind of sounds like to me as I'm reading it. I don't know how it sounds to you, but that's the way it sounds to me. But I want you to dissect this. Don't just read it, dissect it, because I think you're going to hear some things in here that should tell you that why you should not trust JJ Abrams anymore. Let's go on. The filmmaker, this is Chitwood now talking, the filmmaker continued by citing influences older than Star Wars that made up what he says are the least important aspects of the movie. JJ Abrams again. I can understand that someone might say, oh, it's a complete ripoff. Well, it is. We inherited Star Wars. The story of history repeating itself was, I believe, an obvious and intentional thing, and the structure of meeting a character who comes from a nowhere desert and discovers that she has a power within her, where the bad guys have a weapon that is destructive but that ends up being destroyed. Those simple tenets are by far the least important aspects of the movie, and they provide bones that were well proven long before they were used in Star Wars. Okay, here's more attempt to justify his actions and to justify the actions of Disney. What was important for me was introducing brand new characters using relationships that were embracing the history that we know to tell a story that is new, to go backwards, to go forwards. So I understand that this movie, I would argue much more than the ones that follow, needed to take a couple of steps backward into very familiar territory or terrain. That's not how you do this. I mean, once again, you see the kind of bollocks that this guy is capable of. Taking a couple of steps backward doesn't mean copying a plot that has already been used nearly point per point per point. You rehashing scenes, just mixing different characters and maybe a couple of different minor scenarios into those scenes, nearly item per item. That's not what this means. This is pure bollocks. I want you to hear this garbage. Let's go on. So what does he say now? Okay. He says, which is, again, I would argue, not a brand new concept, admittedly, but use that to do, I think, a far more important thing, which is to introduce this young woman who's a character we've not seen before and who has a story we have not seen before, meeting the first stormtrooper we've ever seen, who we get to know as a human being, to see the two of them have an adventure in a way that no one has had yet. Well, that's not true either. With Han Solo, to see those characters go to find someone who is a brand new character who, yes, may be diminutive, but is as far from Yoda as I can think a description of a character can get. Here he's talking about Maze Kanata, one of the many other different types of diminutive characters who were in this story. And here again we can cite Poe Dameron, who I believe was a diminutive or derivative of Wedge Antilles. You can cite General Hux, who was a derivative of Grand Moff Tarkin, also from A New Hope. You can cite, of course, Kylo Ren, who is a Darth Vader 2 wannabe. How much further do we need to go on here? Okay, so let's continue with his nonsense. So he says, almost in the way a wonderful older teacher or grandparent or great aunt might. You know something that is confirming a kind of belief system that is rejected by the main character, and to tell a story of being a parent and being a child and the struggles that entails. Clearly, Star Wars has always been a familial story, but never in the way that we told here. Well, that's not true either. The guy is getting wound up in his own lies. I mean, this is stupid. Okay, I'm not going to go on and keep reading this. This is pure bollocks. And so I don't want to keep reading this to waste my time or yours. But what I do want to do now is tell you what I've said here. I'm going to explain a little bit to you. To me, the bollocks is very strong with JJ Abrams. And this is a man who has spewed this nonsense that you just heard about how it was necessary to take a step back in order to go forward, and how George Lucas himself derived Star Wars from other primary sources older than his own take on the classic hero tales. We know that, okay? That's not new information. And it is more than acceptable that JJ Abrams and Disney would want to use the classic hero archetypes and ideals in The Force Awakens. That's not what the problem is here. Those archetypes are as old as the human species, all right? And stories encompassing them have been around for thousands of years, and they have been thousands of years in the making. The critical difference here is that the stories tell the same tale of the human experience fundamentally because human nature hasn't changed. That's why they tell the same tales, but they do so with different scenarios, they do so with different situations, they do so with different dimensions of ideas coming into mind to fit the new nature of human reality as humans discover new things, and they do so with different types of situations. They don't repeat the same garbage over and over again, point per point, plot point for plot point, scene for scene, or whatever, whether it be in print or in film, whatever is going on. Okay, so this is why I say what JJ Abrams did, and this is the critical difference between what he's trying to justify he did and what George Lucas did, and what others have done before, long before George Lucas. What Abrams did was to copy almost to an instant the same storyline, the same plot points, and the same characters from a tale that we have already seen 38 years ago. The man plagiarized. I mean, if Disney had not bought Star Wars from George Lucas, and if they had gone and done something like this, while George Lucas still owned Lucasfilm and still owned Star Wars as a franchise, they would have been guilty of copyright infringement. They would be taken to court and sued. That's how similar this Star Wars was to A New Hope. Okay, and rightly so. So the beatdown that is coming to JJ Abrams, Kathleen Kennedy, Disney, they deserve it 100%. All right, so let's go on. Do we need to accept this garbage? No, we do not. And I, for one, am trying to get you to recognize, or I'm trying to persuade you. I'm not trying to get you to recognize. I think most of you watching this already recognize what I'm talking about. I'm trying to persuade you that you don't need to trust JJ Abrams again. And I'm also trying to persuade you that maybe, just maybe, you need to reconsider whether or not Episode 8 is something you need to rush out and see. I'm asking you to think strongly about that. I know I'm not going to do so. I'm going to wait. I'm going to watch, and I'm going to look at reviews. I'm going to read spoilers. I'm going to do it. I'm going to watch your videos on YouTube before I go out and spend 1 red cent to see Episode 8, whatever the heck it's going to be called. Because I no longer can trust Jar Jar Jeffrey Jacob Abrams. 2 Star Trek movies, Star Wars The Force Awakens. He screwed up 2 different franchises now. How much more trust do you think he needs to get from you? Unconditional trust, just on his word, because I'm JJ Abrams. Give me a break, people. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next section now. My last thoughts on the characters. I'm going to start let's start with Finn. What I'm going to say about Finn is pretty much what I basically already said, so I don't think that there's a whole lot that needs to be repeated about him. But I will just summarize a few things that maybe I left out in the first the first section on Finn. You can see that. It's called The Finn Factor. It's a video on it, and of course that's at my blog spot.